Hello, everybody. Welcome to Velocity Oil and Gas presentation today. Appreciate everybody being online to hear us out and talk a little bit about Velocity, some of our projects, and one of our target projects that is actually the subject of today's meeting. Presentation will be by myself, Troy Stafford, Vice President, and Kevin Knorr, Operations Manager. We started Velocity Oil and Gas with a group of friends and family, and we started looking at going after small oil and gas plays in Texas. Our business plan has been fairly simple. We assembled a highly experienced team of industry professionals. We adhere to the pursuit of low risk resource play leases. We're going after things that we know will produce at some level and cash flow very early on in the project's start. We acquire shallow to medium depth wells, mainly shallow. We want wells that we can rework at a low cost. Once you get into wells that are 20, 30,000 foot deep and something goes wrong, it costs way too much money to fix that well and make it produce again. We develop prospects where we have first-hand knowledge. We make sure that our geologists, our seismologists, our superintendent Frank Hill know the area, have experience with wells in the area, understand the history of the oil and gas industry in that specific area. We want to keep our LOE costs, our lifting costs, at $15 a barrel or less at full production. That keeps our goal of making sure our profits are returned to our working interest partners and not into expenses. So we want wells that are resource plays, are shallow, first-hand knowledge, and have low lifting costs. If we have a well that has tons of maintenance, constant maintenance and pulling of pumps, then that reduces the working interest back to our working interest partners. We started this philosophy based on a quote from a gentleman that I know who basically got me into this type of resource play, Jake Sanford. And what he said was, the big guys just give away the wells that produce less than 20 barrels. And he's right. We're finding all kinds of resource plays that are like 6 barrels or 8 barrels and really just require new technology, new types of chemical washes, and new types of pumping systems in order to either keep them pumping or enhance their flow rate. The current status of the company is this. We have 4 leases that we currently control. Under there are 9 wells. 3 wells are right now producing, and we're producing about 42 barrels of oil, and currently we do not produce any gas. Taking that and pushing it out on a 12-month calendar, we're looking at about a 1.4 gross annual revenue. Where do we want to be in 12 months? Well, in 12 months, our goal is to take these 4 leases that we have and make sure that we put them into full production. We want all 9 wells rolling and producing. We want to be about 145 barrels of oil per day, and we should be at around 300 MCF of gas. And this is the Kemper well right here. This is actually our subject well. And one thing I want to say is we were involved with the Merrick well, putting a lot of capital expenses into that well at one time. And we got a call to go look at this Kemper well over in Tomball, Texas. At the time, we weren't interested in bringing on a well anytime soon. We wanted to make sure Merrick was going, Brown was going, and we were starting to look at our drilling plan for San Felipe. Well, just so has it, we go see this well, and we call it the Decker's Prairie Field Lower Wilcox Workover Project, Kemper's Well number 1. Now, the Kemper's well is coming through. Mr. Kemper passed away here in December. Mrs. Kemper's attorney, who was Mr. Kemper's best friend, contacted a friend of Frank Hill, who's our partner, and said, please go look at this well. She needs to know what is production, what production can come out of this well. Is it producible? Is it worth holding on to? So we're all flying home, and we decided to stop by Tomball, Texas, and it's right here in Montgomery County in what's called the Decker's Prairie Field, just outside of Houston. I believe it's about 45 minutes from the city, or from the inner city of Houston. And this well just happens to be in what they call the Wilcox producing zone. This is an area in Texas that produces the majority of the gas for the major metropolitans, especially Houston, are produced right here in this zone. And it is a hot zone as it was today, as it was 20 years ago. Still producing lots of gas, lots of oil, and just we're right in the thick of it. As you can see, our prairie field is right here, right there in the middle of that zone. When we go out to the field, what we find is kind of astonishing. This whole thing is just covered in bushes and grime. The ladder is down. The well is not shut off. There's no locks on the well heads. No, everything is as if it was just left and abandoned. We first saw there was about 300 psi on the well, on the casing and on the tubing. When we turned open the valve, this thing went up to 700 psi, so we have a flow rate that increased immediately. Now that's pretty common in wells, so we said, not a big deal, so let's test this thing for a little while, see what it does. And the flow rate went from 1,000 barrels of condensate per day to about 2,000 barrels of condensate per day. The pressure went from 300 to where it roughly stands now at about 1,500 psi on the casing. That is a significant difference. That is a big change. What we discovered in a lot of wells that are shut in is that you can, though their pressure will be really high when you come up to them, because you basically have built a bubble of gas over time, and their flow rates may even be really high, but they will decrease immediately if there's no flow in from the formation. So we've got a formation that's so what we had to do then is say, what is the history of this well? Why has this well been closed in since really closed in since 2001, second small shot in 2004, but truly it was closed in the Wilcox Graham sand zone in 2001. And what is the history of this well? What does the history tell us? So the Kemper well was drilled in 1991 to 12,800 feet. The original operator was Hardy Oil and Gas, which was a major oil and gas operator in this area and across central Texas for years. They perforated in all the right places. They perforated 36 feet into the upper side of the lower Wilcox Graham sand, which right where you want to be, where everybody else was and everybody else was producing. To date, the well's produced a total of 5.1 billion cubic feet of gas, 351,000 barrels of condensate. That's big. This was the biggest well in the area in 1991 and between 1991 and 1994. So, and in between those periods of 1992 and 1994, it produced 3.4 million or 3,400 cubic feet of gas and 280 barrels a day of oil. So 3.4 million cubic feet of gas and 280 barrels of oil per day during 92 and 94. This thing was literally the hottest well in this prairie, not only in this prairie, but in the fields around it. So what happened? Well, we know that in 1994 the well was shut in due to flooding in the immediate area of Tomball, Texas. And a majority of the wells in this area were all shut in. They were shut in, closed down for safety purposes. And then on this particular well, however, other wells managed to survive, come back online. But this particular well, there's actually a series of mishaps over the next 10 years that basically cause it to be shut down either for financial reasons and or just lost production. So the way to really put the history in perspective and really start to understand it is I like to build a timeline. So we built the timeline and we started looking at this thing, and like I said before, it came in at 3,400 MCF of gas, right? It came in at 280 barrels of oil per day. And at that time, it was producing $38,000 per day in gross revenue in today's dollars. Great well. Flood happens in 94. It gets shut in. They try to turn it back on in 95, and the rates drop considerably. So the rate drops from 3,400 MCF to 1,200 MCF, and then from 280 barrels of oil per day to 80 barrels of oil per day. So this is a significant drop. It basically drops into a third of what it was prior to the flood. So in a 6-month time frame, or a 6 to 8 month time frame, they turn this thing back on and they lose a huge amount of production. From that point of turning it on in 95, it continues to decrease. All right, so it decreased to a flow rate of 800 MCF and 40 barrels of oil per day. This well was meant to produce at very high levels. It was a very expensive well. Our calculations are it was about a $7 million well to $9 million to just produce and drill this well, including all the overheads and soft costs. So it's not worth it for for Hardy Oil and Gas to continue. So they sell it to Mariner. Mariner buys it at a discount. However, the flow rates when Mariner takes it over continue to fall. So Mariner starts looking at a rework, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they basically decide, okay, we're going to pull the tubing in about 2,000 foot. So they float at a very decreasing rate from about 96 to 2,000, and they decide they're going to rework the hole and get the lower Wilcox flowing again. When they go to do that, they discover there's a hole in the tubing in the casing. Okay, big cost. It was in the upper casing and in the lower tubing. Their flow rates are falling. Their costs are going down, and they shut it in again in 2000. So they shut it in 2000, and it's producing 351 MCF per day and 16 barrels of oil per day at the shut-in. Now, this thing continues to be shut in for about 2 years, and in 2001, they decide to sell, Mariner sells it to SDG for another huge discount. SDG buys this thing thinking, okay, flow rates are really small and probably continuing to decrease. And what their plan was to unplug it, plug it at the lower Wilcox and go up and perforate the upper zones of the upper Wilcox, which is a risky decision because the upper Wilcox is a much more compact zone, a tighter zone, requires either fracking or a large amount of chemical processing to get those zones flowing. But they figured the lower Wilcox was done, just according to the history, and it was time to see what the other zones could do. However, so they go to pull the packer. They've got their rework. They've raised their money. They go to pull the packer and the tubing, and all of a sudden the packer and the tubing fall down the hole. All right, so it falls down the hole in 2000. They have to shut this hole in again. All right, it takes them a while to even get back to the hole because they now have to raise money to get this stuff out of the hole. Now, fishing costs is what they call it, and fishing costs for getting tools or equipment out of a hole are very, very expensive. I would imagine this was probably a $1 million to $1.5 million job just to get these items out of the hole so they could go back in and plug the hole. They finally raised the money, and They finally raised the money. They plugged the lower zone, and by the time they went to perforate the upper zones, all they could do is really perforate and see what happened, and it basically continued to decrease. They didn't have the money to go into those upper zones like you need to with fracking, chemical washes, and the expensive stuff. They were just hoping for the best. Finally, this thing gets shut in for good in 2004. But the real shut-in as far as the Wilcox zone was in 2000, okay? Because 2001 was when the Wilcox zone was truly shut in, but the total well was shut in about 2004. So the Wilcox zone shut-in has been sitting there doing nothing since 2001. So we're looking at over 10, 12, 13 years of no production in that zone. And what we decided to do is obviously look at the wells around us. And I want to make note that the wells around us produced in the Wilcox zone for 11, 13, 12, 14 years after the flood. Okay, so we've got the flood period right here in 2004, and these zones continue. These other wells, our sister wells, continue to flow at very constant flow rates. after the flood. And I want to point this out really quick because this is really important. In 1999 to 2000 is when we call the Lower Wilcox shut in. That's when the Lower Wilcox was shut off. Even during that time period, that Lower Wilcox was producing $2,400 a day in today's dollars. 351 MCF, 16 barrels a day. So to us, even now, if it was producing that, that would be a great well. We could definitely make money with this well, and it was a well that was considered not worthy back in this time frame. Now remember, in the 80s to early 90s, oil fell as low as $15 a barrel, so it makes sense. But to us, if that thing was doing, if we know it's doing 16 barrels and 351 MCF, we buy this well. So we decided to figure out what happened. And in order to do so, we needed to go look at the wells around us. What did they do? Why did they come back online? Why did we not come back online? And we looked at all the sister wells who directly were producing at some point and some time in the Lower Wilcox zone for oil and gas. And in gathering that information, we identified the wells, we identified the information for each well, a lot of this stuff provided by the state of Texas. And we started producing the graphs. We started analyzing their flow rates for both gas, oil. We started analyzing their casing rates. But one thing I want to point out is we made sure that we only analyzed those time periods where the wells around us were only producing out of that Wilcox zone, so that we were comparing apples to apples. Some of these wells produced out of the Wilcox zone, lower zone, and then also went up and perforated more. So we didn't want to compare that. We want to make sure we're comparing just that lower Wilcox zone, which is the hot zone. So in looking at all these wells, gathering the information, we put that into what's called an RPI software. And RPI software isn't just the flow rates of gas and oil, which is the most significant, but it's the flow rates of water, the pressure tests that they are required to do by the state every 1 to 2 years, depending on the size of the well. It tells us a lot. The casing pressure, the tubing pressure, the pressure of turning the casing off, and how long the pressure rate, how fast the pressure rises. All this information is recorded information that goes into this RPI software. And what the RPI software does is it produces, these analytical graphs of all these scenarios for the wells around, and it combines that into what's called a reservoir productivity index. Now, reality of this is what it is it's taking the history of the wells around it, all the related information and the resource information that show how they flowed and what pressures of gas and air and water they flowed with, and it's producing a model for us that says, hey, if it wasn't for the flood, we should have had a gas line way up here. If it wasn't for the flood, we should have had an oil line here. Instead, we dropped off significantly. Okay, so we should have, in all intents and purposes, been started out after the flood somewhere around 1,200 to 1,300 MCF of gas. We should have, for all intents and purposes, started out around 100 to 130 barrels of oil per day. So what was the significance? Why did this well not follow the same standard? In order to answer that question, we really need to look at our formation. The formation that we're in, like we said, this is a look at the Lower Wilcox Graham sand. Now, our well for an oil and gas well is in a perfect location. We are on the upper side of the actual formation. So this formation is going up right here, and we are trapped by a fault line behind us and a fault line to the side. So we have a triangular trap for oil and gas, which in all intents and purposes, that is a perfect scenario for an oil and gas well. Unfortunately, it's also a perfect scenario for a huge 99-year flood, because what happens is the formation pushes the water up, the fault lines flood, and we also trap water in this formation. So the depletion of the water in this formation is going to take a very long time. Unlike the wells out here in the outer perimeter and not inside the triangular zone, the formation these formations depleted much faster than we did. So in reality, what this well needed was time. There was not a lot of patience with the lower Wilcox zone, but it finally did deplete, and we strongly believe that water is gone. All our flow tests show hardly any water, mainly oil, gas, and condensates. So, a formation that was perfect for oil and gas was also perfect for what they call waterlogging or water bridging. Now, you also need to look at the well bore during the flood. Now, what happened here was this thing is perfectly perforated at the top of the lower Wilcox zone. The well was producing an awesome amount of oil and gas, but what happened was the water was pushing down here, pushing from the back, and also was being trapped in from the formation. So our wellbore zone was basically water flooded and bridged, and only letting small amounts of oil and gas through the water bridge. Why didn't it come back online quicker? Because it was a perfect scenario. Why did the other wells come back online faster? Because they weren't in that wellbore trap. Let's go back to where we're at on reserve analysis. Taking the RPI, taking the reserve analysis done in 1990 and the one that was produced now, we come with an original gas in place calculated to be about 9.5 billion cubic feet for this well. Now, everyone takes it down a factor with 75%. You use about 25% non-recovery factor or a recovery factor of 75%. That says that 7.125 billion cubic feet of gas should have been recoverable for this well. The total recovered to date that we know of is about 5.1, meaning that on the high end, there's 2 billion cubic feet of gas still remaining recoverable. And on the low end, there's about 1.1 billion cubic feet of gas recoverable. Now, doing an analysis that basically compares the barrels of oil per million cubic feet, we've come up with a very conservative analysis that says there's about 110,000 barrels of oil remaining in the hole. Okay? Looking at the characteristics right now and looking at how the well is acting and reacting to our testing and trying to reduce the pressure, looking at the oil flows, we know that the water has receded. We're not getting a lot of water out of the bottom of this hole. So the water has receded. But when doing expectations, you still have to develop an economic analysis. And what we did was we took those expectations, we took our geologist information, seismologist information, and we said, okay, let's build our economic analysis. What is that going to look like? Well, we utilized an 8-year flow life period. And the reason we did that is we looked at a lot of the wells around our well and realized that when you look at a constant depletion rate, most wells have a constant depletion rate period. It's not always constant, but it's pretty close. Most of the wells had an 8-year constant depletion rate. They would deplete approximately 5% on oil per year. They deplete approximately 7 to 10% on gas per year. So we used an 8-year flow rate just so that we could have some sort of constant for the lower Wilcox sand. The economic model shows the well initially producing about 600 MCF of gas and about 50 barrels of oil per day. So we went a little bit lower on the oil, and we cut the gas approximately in half, which we're trying to be, again, conservative for purposes of we're also putting our money into this well and want to see what our risk factors are. Just using those assumptions, it's producing $3 million in gas revenue and $7.8 million in oil revenue over an 8-year period. The economic analysis shows that the capex and/or the investment into the well is returned within 6 months, at least less than 9 months, returning a net revenue of $1 million in the first year to the production partners. Great economic analysis. Now, I can look at this economic analysis, or we can send it to you also as a digital file for further review. But here it is. We're showing, I want to show you the depletions. We're showing a 5% depletion per year on oil, 10% depletion on gas. Your gross revenues are coming out somewhere around $10 million over an 8-year period. The costs. The costs are right at $500,000. We did a little rounding up and down to keep it as an even number, but the reality is this is a good number. Our soft costs, acquisitions, management, legal, the whole 9 yards, about $148,000. Estimated work over costs, about $260,000 to go back down, do the plugs, redo the top head. New plumbing, hydro testing, piping, exchanging of pipes, hydro testing of tanks, whole 9 yards, including above ground and below ground work, obviously, is about $260,000. To stimulate and treat the well, it's about $292,000. This is done by a subcontractor. We'll do clean out of perforations, chemical wash, and a couple other little things to the pump system to make sure that lower Wilcox zone is free to flow. So we got a $500,000 cost. We personally have rolled over about $200,000 in those costs Let's talk about the well status. When we went out there, it climbed from 300 to 600 psi immediately 3 months ago. We're currently flow testing the well, and at flow testing, we have climbed the pressure on the casing has climbed up to 1,500 psi. Working interest. So we're $300,000 short. We got to move quick. So what we decided to do is Velocity Oil and Gas is going to sell part of its working interest in the Kemper well number 1. We're going to sell 25% of the working interest in Kemper's well number 1 for $300,000. That's the goal. And basically start this project. Here is a full sheet of the economic analysis. It basically runs through, what I showed you before on the gross revenue and rolls that into the year-by-year analysis of the expenses, the future net revenue, and shows how that 25% looks over time. I do the majority of the financials, and done several projects from Alaska to Texas. You got David Smith. He's a long-term attorney in the state of Texas for oil and gas. Got George Parks. He's our land guy. He's done so much work on this project already, and really done. Sam Leroy is the seismologist. He comes with lots and lots of credentials. Kevin Knorr, he's our operations and logistics manager. He has over 18 years managing his own businesses and other people's businesses from the operations and logistics side of things. Paul Britt is the company geologist. I leave you with this sheet. This is a working interest potential, and this sheet allows you to look at, a level of investment across a level of risk, minimum, assumption, and max, which you'll see here is sort of what we do in our analysis. We use our assumption, and then